Nice to have you here for my first time. Nice to meet you.
No, thank you so much for having me back again.
I want to talk to you about, as you can tell from that introduction, the idea of the writer as a public figure, because some fiction writers are, notoriously introverted. They'd rather let their books speak for them. Was that ever you?
Well, I don't particularly like to have to rouse myself up from my work. I think, even those of us who have a progressive bend, some folks I'm sure are like me. I often find myself reluctant and wanting to be to the work, but the other part of me also is that I always question what in the world is this privilege that as an artist I've been granted is for, if not for perhaps interjecting myself into conversations and using that as a way to, further certain kinds of critical and necessary discussions and defending folks, honestly, who don't get a lot of defense out there.
But it seems like maybe this was in you somehow even before you became a recognized writer. I mean, you were something of a student activist, were you not? Did you always sort of feel that um, urgency to speak out on things where you saw the need to comment?
Yeah, I think part of this is, even when I was definitely, as soon as I got to college, I got caught up in all of the student activism of the late 80s and early 90s. We'd just gotten off of the apartheid divestment movement, and there was a lot of fervent, there was just a lot of energy in the campuses. More than it's really difficult to communicate how much there was on every front, I went to a public school with a public women's college. The feminist and the women of color feminist movements were really present. So all of that had an enormous impact. But even in those days, I have to say, I was very committed, but I definitely liked being, the envelope stuffers more than, giving speeches or being up front. I was never the guy or the young woman who would be on the mic for 20 minutes giving a speech. I preferred kind of, being in the back and stuffing envelopes.
Well,
So,
and doing your craft. I mean,
yeah, and working my full-time job. Yeah, and all the things we have to do when we're in school. Yeah.
I read that you were quite overwhelmed in the late 1990s when you got a lot of attention for your debut collection, and you suddenly you were the go-to guy, or one of them, for you were asked to be the voice of the Dominican diaspora, the immigrant experience, mainstream media kind of coming at you a lot. What was that like, especially
I
as a new writer?
you just duck down because the best part about this culture is that this culture has, it's absolutely, no attention span. So you just keep your head down a little bit and it'll
And hope it
switch
goes
on.
away.
Oh, it'll go away. Unless, you're Drake and Beyonce, it's going to go away real quick, especially when you're in the literary arts. The best thing about
I don't
being
know.
a
Isn't
writer.
this like your third visit to Q? We're not going away.
Yeah, but it's one thing that there's there's folks who are kind of dedicated to a kind of an intellectual conversation or dedicated to books. But for the most part, that's not the general culture. For the most part, if you're a writer, you get a lot of anonymity in some ways.
Except you can't possibly believe that to a degree, because there you are. You post on Facebook, you share. I mean, I'm jumping forward now from where you were, what you might have been feeling like in the 90s, but you must believe to a certain extent that it is worth it to pipe up.
Oh, no, I'm not saying it's not. I'm actually not at all. I think it's absolutely necessary for people to take. I think it's important for people to be civically engaged. It's important that folks who have all the power and can control all the media are not the only voices. And in a society like ours, which seems to discourage dissent in so many ways, I think it's absolutely necessary for there be countervailing voices. There is no democracy that can call itself healthy without countervailing voices. And I think that, I've always felt that was what made being a member of these societies, being a member of any societies, sort of, you know, just valuable and just normal, is to be able to have, have a role in at least a conversation.
Is that part of what you encourage? Because I know you feel strongly about being part of a continuum of writers of color, and you want to pay homage to that and pay it forward. You've helped create, I don't know, is it VONA, VONA, Voices of Our Nation Arts Foundation, a community for emerging writers of color. You're an established writer, a professor at MIT, a MacArthur Fellow. Is that in all that work that you do in cultivating and encouraging writers and voices of color, is the writing encouragement the main thrust of it, or are you also encouraging that speaking out?
Well, one hopes that, you're doing multiple encouragements, that you're opening spaces for all sorts of different strategies, because, it's one of our jobs, for those of us who are doing pedagogy, for those of us who are doing teaching, for those of us who are in cultural spaces and art spaces. Part of our job is also that we model, that we give people alternatives for what's possible out there, how one can live inside of the world. And certainly I learned a lot of my stuff from having been modeled to by faculty members, by older folks, by activists. And that, had an enormous impact on me. It's just, look, I just am always sort of, it is not an easy place out there to be even slightly progressive. It is not an easy place out there to have any kinds of critical opinions, even in our so-called vaunted democracies. And encouraging what we call courageous speech. Yeah, not like hate-mongering kind of speech, not the sort of incendiary nonsense that you get from certain American political candidates, but courageous speech where folks actually speak against the kind of injustices and the kind of brutalities of our societies. I think that this is a key skill that is something that we should, invest in, and it's something that we should develop in anyone, whether they're young or they're old, to give people that kind of a framework and even the language to understand that there is this kind of intervention, that there are participations that without our societies and our democracies cannot remain healthy. This is important. It was taught to me, and when I was a kid in college and people were telling me, yo, you got to stand up for stuff. You've got to be out there fighting for the society, because if we don't fight for the society is going to be ill. My first reaction to this is I was a kid working, delivering pool tables with an immigrant broke-ass family, and I had a million things on my plate, and I was thinking, yo, this is the last thing I have room for. I mean, I still remember when I was in college and people would hand me flyers and say, hey, come to this rally. And I'd be like, I got a job, yo. I have a full-time job. Y'all here on campus kicking around and going to parties. I'm like working to pay for this education. But even with that kind of plaint that I make, there was a part of me in the back of my head who could remember all of my mentors and all my teachers and all my neighbors saying that no matter who in the world you are, you have a debt to this society. No matter what your position is, I was this poor kid working my way through college, that you take more out of this world than you give back. And therefore, part of the way we pay back the interest to what we owe to our larger societies is to attempt to do some kind of community work. And I realized as I was grabbing these flyers and throwing it back at people's faces that, in fact, I had a debt that I wasn't paying. No matter how badly I thought I was under it because I had this job and I was juggling all these other things and I was broke, I realized I owe people something. And that kept me awake at night. And eventually that encouragement, that inspiration led me to begin to engage in these kinds of actions and these kinds of activities.
I think a lot of people listening would recognize that feeling that you're describing and that passion as something that they experienced in, the days of university and college. Your sort of youthful determination to speak out and to, as you say, be vocal about what needs to be addressed in our democracy. And yet a lot of people, for a variety of reasons, get tired. That full-time job you speak of does sort of, people say, oh, I'm busy, I'm committed, I'm stretched. even for writers, they say, "Look, I'm doing what I can through my writing, through my craft." I'm curious how you haven't let go of that youthful attitude.
Well, look, I mean, everyone goes through stuff in their lives. Look, and one never knows the kind of work that people are doing. I mean, I know plenty of moms, for example. I live in a world where there's a lot of single moms, yeah, who are doing enormous, effective, and political and important sort of mentoring labors inside of their own families. Yeah, without that, there's no way that we could have any kind of future. I think that it's difficult to sort of sift out what is needed and what is not needed. And certainly people get tired and people get discouraged. And this society has a way of making folks conform and making folks fall quiet, making folks go quiescent. And that's part of who we are as well. There's some people who are like knuckleheads. I'm just a knucklehead. It's not as much that there's some sort of eternal
It
inspiration.
is one of the first words people use to describe you.
Well,
You're a
no, I'm
knucklehead.
I'm a knucklehead. I'm super stubborn.
How are
I
you a
can't.
knucklehead?
I'm super stubborn. I grew up in a family with an enormous amount of inequity, an enormous amount of injustice, and I think that if you grow up in a family as a kid looking at this stuff, I can't help it. I even if it's not good for me at whatever given moment, I have a problem with that kind of stuff. And I, for some reason, can find the energy for it. Other folks can, and I understand, but I wouldn't judge those folks because they're probably doing stuff that is equally as important to hold everything together. I think if you feel the need, that you feel that you're not doing enough, if you feel that call, there's a billion ways that we could give back to our society. And I think that for most folks is that they're like, damn, what can I do? What can I have? What can I be? And how can I help? And I think that once people take the first step, it's remarkable what ends up happening. But, we belong to societies, whether it's Canada or the United States, I know this well, with a very active civil society where there's a lot of people giving a lot back. And this is the one thing that, this kind of neoliberal moment hasn't demolished. I don't notice so much how quiescent people are. What I notice is despite all the pressures for us to shut up and do nothing and let these bastards ruin the world, so many folks do stuff. So many folks are out there. And that's what strikes me the most is not our deficits, but that we work so hard, we struggle so hard, we push towards justice despite everything that's aimed at us. And that is an enormous encouragement and inspiration, enormous.
So let's talk about, you mentioned all this reaching out that you do. You post on Facebook. You sort of constantly.
I do very little, to be honest, but okay.
Well, no,
Uh,
you seem like you have a real uh, attention to a lot of issues that go right outside of literature. You are reaching out to politics. To I mean, this event that you're at in Toronto tonight, this Penn event, touching on diaspora, globalization, writing as outreach. In terms of being relevant to our real lives in North America, what on that list? What is top of mind for you in that mix?
well, look, I'm a Caribbean immigrant. I'm in the city that has, like New York, a tremendous community of Caribbean immigrants. I'm a member of a diaspora. I'm a member of a Dominican diaspora, yeah, and living in a country that is a settler colony, yeah, that is descended from a settler colony. And there's something about being a Caribbean living in the United States, which is probably rhymes with being a Caribbean living in Canada. And I think the question of, this double question of immigration, yeah, and First Nation rights, I think is absolutely entangled and essential for these societies to begin to confront not only their legacy, but what is owed. Yeah, what is owed. I'm in the Dominican Republic. Canadian mining is down in Santo Domingo, stripping the hell out of the country, stripping the hell out of it. Yeah, people are always telling me, oh, Canadians are so nice. I'm like, you should come to this mine and see how nice Canadians are. And I think that there's there's these tremendous legacies that we're all wrestling with. And certainly this idea of what globalization is and what it represents, part of it has a lot to do with the ways that immigrants come, and has a lot to do with the ways that these wealthy societies project their kind of damaging corporate power into the societies from which these immigrants are coming from. And then the question of the folks who this land belonged to or was theirs from the beginning. All of this stuff is entangled. And for me, that plus the issue of women and children. Yeah, like women and children are the victim of all the diabolical, malign, toxic policies and machinations of our societies. Yeah. And how are we confronting the needs of women and children?
What's the role of in all what you touched on a lot of issues,
Well, you
and
asked, so I
well,
thought I'd give you the sweep
no, I know,
of
and
what
there's a
keeps me
sweep, and you're
awake.
just getting started. But I
No,
wonder
not at all.
too, just what you see the role of fiction as being in creating understanding around. First Nations issues, Black Lives Matter. I mean, Islamophobia, the refugee crisis. There's so many issues that I know keep you up at night. But as a fiction writer, what do you see as the role of fiction in cultivating understanding?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, that's a very difficult question. I'm an inveterate reader. I am a reader long before I'm a writer. I've been reading books since I could read. It's the thing that most compels me, the thing that most gives me life, the thing that most gives me inspiration. I think that for me, that encounter with this literary art has been deeply transformative. And yet, the mystery of its power, I think, is the thing I'm most aware of. Some folks say that reading in the arts make people more compassionate. I believe that. It seems to have made me more compassionate. But there's plenty of devil-like readers out there, people who are like, oh, I read great literature, and I'm going to put you in a camp. And I think that these are complicated issues. I know that what art is good for seems to be that art puts people in contact with their human selves, their most vulnerable, complex self. The idea is that when we read art or we encounter art or we see dance, it challenges us, it raises up to the level that we should be. But often enough, once the art is over, we lapse back into some of our simplicities. So the idea always is that within art awaits our best selves. And our best selves are what we're going to need to be able to disentangle and confront the complex problems that we need to confront in order to have a future. So the dream of me is that writing is like another art. It is a beacon, perhaps. In my most utopian sense of it, it is a beacon where our best selves await. And if we could keep those best selves active just outside of when we go see ballet or outside of when we go see a painting, if those best selves were the ones that were handling our politics and handling our economy and handling our religion, we would be in far better places. Unfortunately, they tend to lapse back into quiescence very quickly.
I got to pick up on that. I know you posted just this week on Facebook you're calling the state of American politics right now in the current presidential election scary. You use that word with news of Donald Trump's sweep of 5 state primaries. What scares you the most about Donald Trump's popularity right now as a candidate? To your point about bringing our best selves to cope with real life, what scares you most about Donald Trump?
Well, because this is an old reaction in the United States. There's nothing, if you're an immigrant in the United States, Donald Trump and what he represents, this excrescence, is perhaps the most familiar aspect of American culture. In other words, what's really interesting is that the rest of the world is encountering the Trump that immigrants labor under in the United States their whole lives. Yeah, it's just that now it's been raised to a level of worldwide attention and everyone's kind of shocked and everyone's appalled. But when we're living under Trump politics in our daily lives as immigrants in the United States, and I'm sure in Canada, nobody really cares. In other words, the problem is that the overseer is now trying to run for office instead of staying local and beating the crap out of us. And I think that for me, what's really, really troubling about this stuff is that as a nation, it's clear the United States is falling for its most simplistic, reactionary, racist, you know, um, just misogynist answers, patterns to confront what is just really a serious sets of issues that people like Trump are just a distraction from. It's no accident that our political elites and our economic elites that are robbing this planet blind are having us get caught up in discussions that never address their economic and political power. We're sitting around talking about immigrants and walls, and we're not talking about how Trump is an agent of neoliberalism and this is the real problem. But he's now wrapping himself up as a hero. And it's been a perfect ruse. And I think a lot of folks have fallen for it.
I know you've talked about in counter to his talk of a wall, you've talked about building a bridge. You've as recently you were recently in Massachusetts talking about building bridges in your country. How, just my sort of last moment that I have with you, how hopeful are you about that bridge?
I mean, I don't think it makes any difference, the odds that we're up against. I literally think it's always been a tremendous challenge to maintain hope and to attempt to work positively in societies like ours. But look, I used to be owned. Yeah, my ancestors were slaves in this hemisphere. People used to own us
So
all the time.
there must
We
be hope in there
overthrew
somewhere.
that. We overthrew that, and I have faith we will overthrow this.
All right, so good to have you here.